We are in a revolution. But it is a revolution in which the side that fires the first shot loses. We will not fire any shots because our weapon is uncommon good sense.
Hello and welcome to Tractor Time. Tractor Time is brought to you by Barn to Door and Acres USA, the voice of eco-agriculture. I'm your host, Ben Trollinger, editor of Acres USA magazine. On this episode, we travel to the future, a small farm future. That's the title of a new book from farmer and social scientist Chris Smaje. Let's be honest, the future doesn't look great. Our climate is changing rapidly, our soils are being depleted, the global population is surging, our health is falling apart, and despite some progress with renewable energy, we're still very much addicted to cheap fossil fuels. It's a bleak picture that Smage paints in his new book, and while he doesn't offer an optimistic Pollyanna vision for our future, Smage does believe that humans can continue to thrive if only we're willing to radically reshape the way we think about communities and economies. Chris is a farmer himself in southwest England, and he has a durable vision for a resilient and relocalized future built around small peasant farms. But before we get to that interview, we have something a little different. We're starting a new monthly segment for the Tractor Time podcast. We're calling it Transition Land, and it's a partnership between Acres USA and Rodale Institute. The idea is to help farmers looking to transition from conventional farming to a more regenerative approach. And we'll do this by tapping into the deep wealth of knowledge on staff at Rodale. On this episode, we're joined by Dr. Karl Roscher. He has a PhD in microbiology and biochemistry, and he's the research director of the Rodale Institute Midwest Organic Center just outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He recently wrote a column in the December issue of the Acres USA magazine describing the scientific work being done there. And he's serious about what he does to help farmers. So serious, in fact, that in lieu of a more formal greeting, Dr. Roscher had this to say.
Can we just talk about some cool science for a change?
Okay. So you can see where his priorities are. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Karl Roscher. Rodale is at the forefront of research and education in organic no-till farming systems. And I think a lot of people associate Rodale with its home in Pennsylvania, but it now has operations or outposts all over the country. So talk about some of this like missionary organic work you're doing in the Midwest right now.
Yeah, no, that's really great. So we're definitely expanding across the country into a lot of different areas. You know, my research center here in the Midwest, I'm located in Iowa, and then we have another outpost, or what we call regional resource centers, or organic centers, I think is another one in Georgia. And then we have one in Southern California as well. So mine, or the one that I work at, the MOC, or so the Midwest Organic Center, boots on the ground here, August 2019. We spent the first 6 months, I think, till the growing season hit, just what we called the listening tour, you know, trying to meet with as many farmers and other nonprofits or folks interested in organic farming in the region to kind of get a feel for the pulse of what was going on here in the Midwest and what was needed in terms of research. A lot of our goal is to provide assistance, you know, and fill those niches and to work collaboratively with other associations so that, you know, kind of like a rising tide raises all boats. And then we just completed our first growing season. The real mission of the center is to really try and connect with farmers across the spectrum. We're in our own echo chamber. We're talking to organic farmers all the time. You know, I'd really like to talk to conventional farmers that are thinking about this, you know, that might be on the fence or think it's complete BS. And let's have a conversation and try and find some opportunities to agree.
Well, I love the idea of science in service of farming. I'm curious to know more about how you started putting the pieces together that you could help. What did that look like?
What I love most about farmers is they're scientists. They're trying stuff all the time. You know, they don't have the full backing of Rodale Institute like I have, and they can't fail, right? You can't do acres and acres of something and not have it work, where I can. You know, I can run something and maybe it doesn't work and we learn from it. In fact, I enjoy failure. We learn more from failure than we do from success, because you can just be lucky and succeed. Failure is the true problems arise, the nuances that you may not have considered arrive in failure. So to me, that's what we're built to do. I really tried to come into this with, I didn't want to march in here with like, I'm interested in this, and this subject, and that's what I'm going to go do. Because I mean, I'm a microbial ecologist. I really want to look at microbes. I really want to look at carbon. I really want to look at nitrogen. But, that farmer that's trying to produce, 200 bushel corn per acre, they may not be they're trying to get that yield right. So then it was like, well, how do I marry these ideas? Like, how do I take the stuff that they're interested in and show them that, they can still be profitable, but at the same time, apply management practices that can do both, right? So we can do these management practices that preserve the soil, that increase soil health, that increase soil productivity, but at the same time, you can hit that 200 bushel corn.
I'm curious, what is your elevator pitch to a conventional farmer on why they should care about biology in the soil?
To me, it comes down to profitability and inputs, because that's what most conventional farmers are going to talk to you about. It's profitability and what can we do? So I would say, well, look, you could change if you cover cropped, right, with a legume, and you got that biological fixation bump from whatever legume you pick. That's going to give you more nitrogen that you can add to the soil. You maybe pump on less anhydrous, or maybe you don't have to pump anhydrous on at all. Let's just start with one practice. Let's start with one thing that you think you could do and improve soil health. I can show you where you could be more profitable. Just by maybe you don't run as much steel over your land. Maybe you pump a little less anhydrous. Maybe the water quality in your region's a little bit better because you did something different. It doesn't have to be nitrogen. It could be a pesticide. I mean, the things that we're doing to biodiversity of insects as a result of using neonics is scary. It's on the level of DDT. I think at some point we're really going to have to look at that. The research that's coming out is really it's alarming to me. If I can get you to plant, pollinator rows or maintain a buffer strip or something like that, we can talk about how you can be more profitable, right? And most farmers are stewards of the land. They want to manage that and pass that on to somebody. They take great pride in that. And I think sometimes as researchers, we're not very good at tapping into that and saying that we're on your team as well. We're here. I'm not here to tell you how to do it. I'm here to help you figure out how to do it. And you tell me what you can do, and I'll tell you what'll work and what won't. And we'll go from there.
Karl, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure.
If you have any questions for Karl or anyone else at Rodale, email those to me at btrollinger@acresusa.com, and you just might get an answer on future episodes. For more information on Rodale Institute, visit their website, rodaleinstitute.org. I want to take this moment to introduce our new sponsor, Barn to Door. They're doing a new segment aimed at helping farmers, and you'll hear that later in this episode. But who are they? Barn to Door powers farmers who sell direct, helping them increase sales, access customers, and save time. They help farmers meet buyers' expectations through easy ordering and an accessible brand across all online channels. Farmers use software, services, and resources from Barn to Door to manage and promote their business. The bottom line is this: farmers that provide convenient buying and delivery options reach more buyers. Data shows farmers can double revenue when they offer online subscriptions and direct delivery. Promote your brand, manage your orders, and keep your profits with Barn to Door, providing the capabilities and support you need to build a thriving farm direct business. Learn more at barntodor.com/tractor time. Okay, Chris Smaje. For the last 15 years, Smage has run a small farm in Sommerset, England. Before that, he worked as a social scientist at University of Surrey and Goldsmiths College. His focus is the practice and politics of agroecology, and he's written about that subject for publications such as The Land, Dark Mountain, Permaculture Magazine, Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems in the Journal of Consumer Culture. Smage writes the Small Farm Future blog and is a featured author at resilience.org. He has a new book out with Chelsea Green Publishing. It's called A Small Farm Future, Making the Case for a Society Built Around Local Economies, Self-Provisioning, Agricultural Diversity, and a Shared Earth. I was really impressed by the amount of thought Smage has put into actually working out some of the ideas we in the regenerative agriculture world take for granted. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. Hello, Chris. Welcome to Tractor Time.
Hi, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with the ghost of Thomas Malthus. He still haunts the way we think about matters of population. Talk about the Malthusian Trap and how this continues to color our thinking about population growth and food.
There's different ways of talking about Malthus. The one that a lot of people are familiar with is the idea that, we're in overshoot and, a population is outstripping our ability to provide resources. So, the need is for us to cut population numbers. And, I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's a little bit more complicated than that. But there's also a notion of a sort of Malthusian trap that, whenever a human population historically produces a little bit of surplus, what we do with that is produce more of ourselves, and that's been, so there's been a sort of check and a balance. That's the way it works, kind of the way it works in the populations of wild animals. And the argument is that finally, at last, with the coming of industrialization, we've sort of got out of that trap. And I guess I look at that a little bit critically in the book, partly because it has got us into a whole bunch of other traps. And I think, clearly the way the sort of whole package of modern industrialism, stalled growth, climate change, soil, water issues, huge issues of social inequality and so on, it's kind of taken us into a whole bunch of other traps. So, it's kind of a theme of the book in general, is that there's always trade-offs. Anything that we do has knock-on consequences that, that we then need to reckon with.
Right. You write in the book that population growth is a problem, but not the problem. In fact, you outline 10 crises that we face on a global scale. Talk a little bit about those crises.
Well, I mean, the sort of drift of the way I cover it in the book is, there are various kind of immediate underlying crises. Climate change is obviously a very big one that we all spend a lot of time, quite rightly, worrying about, and that is driven basically by, directly or indirectly, by our use of fossil fuels. And it's kind of interesting agriculturally because it there's a kind of indirect pathways as well, in terms of the way that fossil fuels enable biofuel production or livestock use or whatever, and a whole bunch of other issues, of course, that we talk about in the agricultural sector, soil, water, and so on. But then the sort of crises that I move on to sort of in the later part of that sequence are more socioeconomic crises, the sort of the global economic system, and it's ultimately it's a political system, not just an economic system. It's the way that we choose to organize the world, and ultimately that has a kind of history and a culture behind it. So I talk about proximal and underlying crises in that section of the book, and in some ways the sort of the more obvious things, soil, climate change, water, and so on, are the immediate, the proximal crises. But underlying that are kind of human crises, cultural, perhaps even spiritual crises, about the way that we organize ourselves and the way that we relate to the world. So I sort of set the stall out in that early part of the book by sort of going along that trajectory from the immediate proximal material crises that we face to the deeper underlying economic, political, cultural, and ultimately spiritual crises.
The dominant economic and social narrative of the last century or so has been a mass migration from rural areas to urban centers. And this has been happening on a global scale. And it's often branded as a success story about increasing prosperity. What's wrong with that picture, especially now?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two things wrong with it. One is that I would slightly question, as you say, it is presented as a success story, and I certainly wouldn't claim that there's no element of success to it. But in some ways, it hasn't. I would sort of slightly contest that narrative in the sense that kind of what's happened in farming historically is, certainly one argument is what's happening now in other economic sectors like manufacturing, where technological development essentially sort of gets rid of the human labor. So part of this, that big migration that you talk about isn't necessarily people deciding to quit the farm and wanting to move to the city. It's basically being undercut by a sort of global commodity technological export agriculture. Certainly that's one thing where implicitly and explicitly subsidized mechanized agricultures in the richer countries have undercut the production of basic commodities in the poorer countries, and that's pushed small-scale farmers either into sort of tropical commodity production, growing coffee or fruit or whatever, and being very, very exposed to global market fluctuations, or getting out of farming altogether and taking their chances in the city. And part of the narrative we have is often that getting out of farming and going to the city makes people wealthier, but that isn't necessarily the case. Over and over again, we see that the labour exit from one sector doesn't necessarily, employment doesn't necessarily magically appear in another sector. So there's a lot of precarity, a lot of underemployment, and a lot of misery, as we know, in big cities globally. So, one part of the story, I think, is to contest that narrative a little bit. But the other part of the story is to say, even if that has been true historically, when we look at the situation facing us now, it almost certainly isn't going to be true in the future. That mass migration, that urbanization really has been enabled by the availability of cheap and abundant fossil fuels. We know we've got to stop using fossil fuels. Can we create a low carbon energy economy where energy is as cheap and abundant as it has been historically with fossil fuels? Obviously that's a debate that people are having, but it seems to me very questionable whether that's the case. And a whole bunch of other issues to do with economic inequality, the way that we farm, again, those material, but also those cultural, political, economic issues that I think are going to mean that we're going to have to de-urbanize, re-ruralize to a greater or lesser degree. And that's not going to be an easy thing to do at all, but the sooner we bite that bullet, I think the better.
You have a graph in the book that shows fossil fuel consumption over time, and it continues to increase. Meanwhile, you have a thin film of alternative energy sources on the top of that, but that really hasn't changed our consumptive habits globally, these alternative energy sources. Talk a little bit about that. In the book, you talk about energy begets energy. Explain that concept a little bit, and also extrapolate maybe where that's heading.
Right. Well, we are using more low carbon sources of energy than we used to, and but they're basically hydroelectric power or wind and solar or nuclear. And obviously, we can debate the rights and wrongs of those different forms of low carbon power. But yeah, what I show in that graph, it wasn't me that you can find that data in many sources, but I presented it on the basis of BP data. But yeah, it's true that we're using more of that low carbon energy now than we were, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but we're actually using more fossil energy as well, so that the low carbon energy is an addition rather than a replacement. We're not getting out of fossil fuel use. And what's driving that essentially is the growth economy. The way it works is that in order for the economy to sort of keep firing, you need to have return on investment, and that has to have a sort of material manifestation of some sort. So some energy experts sort of talk about it in terms of energy seems to beget energy. But clearly, we're not just burning energy for fun. There's a material trace to it. And what it is the growing global economy, the need to keep producing more, to finding new markets, producing more things, commoditizing and bringing more people into circuits of global commodity exchange. And that is clearly not sustainable, in present terms with high carbon, with fossil fuel energy. And, my argument in the book is, maybe we could replace that with low carbon energy. I think that's very unlikely. But, we hit all sorts of other issues, whether it's water use, soil loss, phosphorus availability, whatever. So, I think we need to think a little bit more laterally or a little bit more deeply and sort of address the underlying cultural and spiritual grounds for that kind of endless growth economy that we, increasingly is causing us problems, and we're kind of hitting the buffers with.
There's an ongoing debate on whether or not small organic farms can feed the world, which is now approaching 8 billion people. I think your book answers, or perhaps addresses, this debate more thoroughly than any source I've seen. How does it work, and why do we have such a hard time believing in the possibility of a small farm future?
I mean, I think one issue is that when we talk, when we have this debate about can organic farming feed the world, there's kind of there's different ways of defining organic farming, and I think what people have in mind is pretty much the present world that we have of, a very highly urbanized world, as you were saying earlier, very mechanized farming, large scale organic farming. So, we're talking about growing a lot of legumes, a lot of fossil fuel inputs going into the farm and the distribution, the whole sort of farm to fork network. Whereas when I'm talking about organic farming in my book, I'm thinking much more of kind of closed loop cycling of nutrients, and inevitably that goes back to ruralization. People by and large living in more rural settings, much more people involved directly in farming, whether that's backyard gardening or homesteading or commercial farming, but smaller scale, more localized, and then much more sort of looping of nutrients. And also, issues about what are we eating? You get into the whole livestock and meat issue. In my book, certainly on a small scale, low impact farming basis, I think there's definitely a strong case for livestock, but not really, it's really the meat eating is kind of skimming off the surface of the way that the livestock are feeding into the larger labor of the farm. So we would be eating less meat and milk than we are at present. And, that's another aspect of the sort of argument that organic farming can't feed the world. That's probably true if we're eating meat at the levels that we do here in Europe or in the US, but not with a lower level of consumption. So, it's hard to say, can organic farming feed the world? I mean, I don't know. Possibly there's a case for some synthetic fertilizer in certain situations. If there is, it's almost certain that fertilizer shouldn't be being used in a country where I live, like the UK or the US. It should be being used by poor farmers in, for example, parts of sub-Saharan Africa with poor soils and all the rest of it. So there's a kind of a fertilizer equity issue that I touch on briefly in the book. But, we can make do with far, far less synthetic fertility and the underlying fossil energy input into that than we currently are, if we are much more thoughtful and much more localized in our farming.
Your book is not a memoir, to be clear. It's a dense and philosophical text about economics and ecology. But I am interested in hearing more about you and your background. You're a small farmer yourself and a social scientist.
Yeah, well, I guess my story is that I studied anthropology originally at university. Thought I might pursue a career in that, and I was kind of interested in peasant farming back then. And did a little bit of research, and I suppose I was, the funny thing looking back at it now is that I didn't actually know anything about farming. I was kind of interested from a more intellectual point of view, kind of in the way that peasant farmers do, or in some circumstances don't fit into the global economy. And obviously, part of that you'll see as sort of carried forward into the book. But anyway, I sort of went down that road a little bit and then got involved in doing various other things, various other types of social science research. And then I guess in my mid-30s, you could call it a early onset midlife crisis maybe, or I started thinking more seriously about food and farming. And obviously, this was in the late 1990s when people were starting to talk more seriously about climate change and some of the sorts of environmental issues we were butting up against. And I found out a bit about permaculture, sort of got interested in gardening. Kind of, I suppose it's the way my mind works. It's always thinking about how things fit into larger loops and cycles, that I kind of suddenly felt this lack in my life of growing and farming and gardening. And yeah, to cut a long story short, my wife and I, we moved out of the city and ended up here in Sommerset, about 100 miles to the west of London. Bought ourselves a small, it was kind of bare land. Originally we kind of wanted perhaps a kind of house with a garden, homestead kind of scenario, but we couldn't really afford that, so we ended up buying this piece of bare land and kind of got involved in a whole lengthy project to move on to it, involve other people in it. And so yeah, for the past 20 odd years, I've been here focusing more or less on that, still feeling like I'm very much a novice farmer, plenty to learn. But yeah, basically we've set up a small local market garden, veg box scheme as we call it here. So we grow veg and sell it to people locally. Various other things going on the site, both in terms of people, but also a little bit of livestock, pasture, trees, and so on. So yeah, that I don't talk about that in great detail in the book because I guess maybe when I got into it, I was a little bit naive and thought, I'll come here and start farming. And, you talked about the sort of the memoir sort of thing about how, people move to the country and have a great life. And in many ways it is a great life. But, when you try and do it commercially and when you're selling veg in competition with, all the other people growing veg around the world and, the cheapness of all the global transport networks, it kind of confronts you with a whole bunch of issues about, about fossil fuel use, about global commodity prices that, sort of draws you back into these problems with the global economy. And the book is very much about that, really, how we can transition from where we're at, economically and materially into, into a more sustainable rural worlds. And I try not to, I try and emphasize the good aspects of those more ruralized, more local worlds without being too starry-eyed about it. There's all sorts of reasons, all sorts of problems and trade-offs that we need to confront.
We're going to hit pause on this interview for a brief segment from our sponsor, Barn to Door.
Hi, this is Cade from Barn to Door. We're excited to be sharing a new series of Farmer Spotlights during the Tractor Time podcast in segments like these. Today's Farmer Spotlight is Grant Sheeter of Sheeter Cloverleaf Dairy. In 2020, Grant launched a Facebook poll to his customers, asking for their thoughts on offering direct delivery on their products. The response was majorly positive, so they gave it a shot. Here's what Grant had to say about the direct delivery process so far.
it's been a crazy fun road, really. When we started this venture, we had about 800 followers on our Facebook page, and now that was in May, and right now we're closing in on 6,000 followers on our Facebook page, and which I mean, to some small farms that's nothing, but for us, for that growth that fast, it goes to show that people are really grasping the thought of having this service to them. And doing the door-to-door, it's been a learning curve for everybody. And thankfully for our customers, they've been so gracious on everything. They really get it. With everybody, a lot of people working from home, for the younger generation are still working, to the more of the retired age people that are buying our products that are usually home anyways. They really make a point for their delivery day. Again, it goes back to the communication. Make sure that they are aware of what time they can expect the delivery. And it's always the same day each week based on the zip codes that we service. We're all humans. We make mistakes or mess up once in a while, but usually it can be fixed pretty readily. And everyone's been so nice about everything. We've had, honestly, I've never had a complaint that we know of yet anyways. And our customer base keeps growing. So I'd like to think that we've done pretty well with our excellent drivers being courteous to the customers.
If you want to hear more about Grant's story, visit barntodoor.com/tractortime.
You outline an ecological vision of farming in the book that's very different from the green revolution approach to agriculture. In the book, you write, "The line I take in this book is not against improving agriculture, it's against agricultural improvement." What do you mean by that?
Well, I suppose I'm referring to a whole tradition of essentially top-down, centralized, elite thinking about agriculture, kind of an anti-peasant approach, really, that we need to improve agriculture with high-tech interventions, with more rationalization of labor, getting people out of farming. There's throughout the world there are very tried and tested low impact indigenous agricultural systems that people have developed, and there tends to be this, I call it this sort of narrative of agricultural improvement, to call that into question, get rid of it, rationalize, mechanize, marketize. So when I say I'm against agricultural improvement, I don't mean we shouldn't be looking to improve the things we do, to rethink things, to innovate. But innovation is a sort of tricksy word, because it's like, who is innovating, to what purpose, and at a cost to which people. So I guess my vision is much more a kind of bottom up one, and I think certainly when we think about a low energy, low impact farming system of the future, there's a lot that we can learn about the way people have done that in the past in low energy, low impact systems. So it's really to try and put aside that whole notion that we've got to be more high tech, we've got to be more low labor, let's just sit a minute with some older ways of doing things. This is not a kind of romantic notion of going back to the past and having to do things exactly as everyone did, exactly as our grandparents did, but to actually be open to taking some inspiration from those systems, and seeing some of the problems that have been caused by the top-down, centralized agricultural improvement narrative, and thinking a bit more about low impact, local, traditional ways of doing things, and how we can learn from those today.
And what does your small farm future look like? From reading the book, there are more trees in it. There's a greater diversity of what's being grown. It's not just about corn, wheat, soybeans. Talk a little bit about permaculture and agroforestry.
Right. Well, certainly in terms of the what it looks like on the ground, the agricultural side of it. I think, I talk about what I call the Arable Corner in the book, where basically there is quite a small number of crops globally that are very highly productive of macronutrients, energy and protein in particular, and very easily mechanizable and processable and transportable. And so, wheat corn, rice are, the three big ones, one or two other ones as well. And, there's nothing wrong with those crops. Obviously, the reason that we grow them in such huge quantities is because they're doing something for us that we want. But, it's problematic in various respects. It's not necessarily that great for our health. Certainly in this country, and I think in the US too, we don't eat enough fresh fruit and veg, and that's largely because fruit and veg, it's harder to kind of industrialize. It's more labor intensive type of cropping. It doesn't really fit so well into the, into that kind of mechanized top-down ag improvement narrative. Trees are a bit of a problem for mechanized cropping. You want to have big fields, big machinery, cut labor costs. Everything about the agricultural system tends to, certainly in the wealthy countries, tends to push away from paying for labor and towards paying for diesel and machinery. So we tend to have big fields, not very many trees, ag surpluses that we then export either to poorer countries or that we use for feeding livestock. So too many arable sort of macronutrient heavy crops, too much livestock, not enough fresh fruit and veg, not enough trees, not enough people in the countryside. So it's much more of a kind of mixed farming, lay farming, you could say permaculture vision, more gardens, more orchards, more trees. Certainly a place for arable cropping, certainly a place for livestock, but we've got to rebalance it, I think.
You say in the book that no one wants to turn back the clock to the hardscrabble life of toil that we associate with our small farm past. We do have a deep fear of poverty and physical labor, hard physical labor, which we do associate with the life of a peasant. Talk about our folk memory of peasant farming and how that will influence the possibility of a small farm future. How do we get people to want to be a peasant again?
Well, that's a great question. It's a funny one because I think part of what the folk memory is about is not necessarily about the hard physical work in farming. I think maybe in a US context, there's a whole kind of colonial frontier homesteading, sort of taming the wilderness kind of thing, and that has all sorts of complex resonances with colonialism and racism and so on, but also undoubtedly hard graft pioneering. But I think part of the folk memory is not so much the hard work as being as the lack of autonomy. As being being a peasant is to be under the thumb of an aristocracy. Is not to be an autonomous person. And so I kind of talk about that in the book. That is a difficult issue that we face in the future. But part of it is about seeking autonomy. And I think, it's interesting in a contemporary context where I think more and more the mainstream world of work and, is one where people lack autonomy, are increasingly being pressured, increasingly precarious employment, high cost housing, low pay, low job security. So I think there is a context in which, the idea of having a garden, having a homestead, producing your own food starts to become more appealing. It can be physically exacting. And of course, nobody really in wealthy countries now really knows what it's like to be a low energy, low impact, really self-reliant farmer. So, I'm not trying to belittle that. But I think that's the context that we have to be thinking about this, and it's partly that there's an attractive autonomy to it, and also it's about producing a healthier diet for ourselves. So much ill health caused by poor diets and by lack of exercise, and this is one of the other strange things where we sort of say, well, we don't want this hard physical labour on the farm. and yet we do all these sort of Ironman marathons or mountaineering or going to the gym or whatever. So I think there are some contexts in which, well, actually, working out in the garden, growing fruit and veg for ourselves, it's not an unappealing vision. But and it's partly getting at that autonomy, I think, is probably the key hook in terms of the way that the present economy is working. But obviously, it's a real fundamental change to what we're used to in terms of how the economy works. So I'm under no illusions that it's an easy switch, but it's one that I think more and more people are interested in making. And certainly with the pandemic, suddenly people really switched on more to insecure global supply chains. A lot of people, where we live, suddenly we got a huge spike in demand for our fruit and veg, a lot more interest in people doing backyard veg gardening. So there's all of these things are pointing, I think, towards the possibility of a small farm future. And we just really need to sort of take that by the horns and run with it.
We do have all these associations with the small farms of our past, particularly here in the U.S. I mean, I think of like Little House on the Prairie and things like that. And I think some people have these associations with patriarchal structures, with a lack of education. That's not what you're arguing for in your book. And I was hoping you might be able to contrast the future you envision with the past that people envision.
I mean, it's certainly a worry. I mean, it's interesting in a US context, because there's the whole context of agrarian populism, the People's Party in the late 19th century. It's not something I know a huge amount about, but obviously populism has become a bit of a dirty word in mainstream politics in recent times. But as with most of these political words, it's a very complex one with many different resonances. But certainly, in US history, late 19th, early 20th century, there was a kind of progressive movement where people who were based in rural or small town settings, they kind of wanted the improvement, of modern life that we've been talking about. They wanted education, they wanted libraries, civic institutions, they wanted to, scientific learning, improvements of various kinds. But what actually happened in reality was that became a very much a kind of urban movement. We were talking earlier about the removal of labor, the mechanization, the industrialization of farming. So that kind of happened, but not in a rural small town context. That got hollowed out. We've had this huge urbanization and a whole set of problems, that we were talking about earlier: energy, climate change, industrialization, and so on. So I think that vision of a kind of civic rural and small town life is still there, and it's what I try and tap into in the book. But I'm not trying to pretend there aren't difficulties. I mean, one thing that I argue in the book is that we need to have a more self-limiting economy. We need to get out of that the energy begets energy thing that you mentioned earlier. We need to limit our needs, and we need to do that by essentially producing for our households and for our local communities. But there is a danger of patriarchy there. I mean, certainly I think the availability of paid work outside the home has been really critical for women to escape patriarchy and to gain, to sort of embark on the road towards equality. So there is a danger in this kind of household small farm vision that I'm articulating, and I talk about it a little bit in the book. Again, I don't think there's any easy answers. There's no magic wand to be waved other than to be aware of that issue and to try and retain, that kind of progressive, civic-minded, that kind of public sphere, that emphasis on democracy, on not taking people's status hierarchies for granted, and I kind of talk about that a bit in the book, the civic republican tradition. So I think we need to tap into some of those older narratives as a way of embracing a more civic, small town and rural life, but without stepping back into some aspects of it that I think we'd be better off without.
You're making me think about what Isaiah Berlin once characterized as positive liberties and negative liberties. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've come across it. I'm a bit hazy on the details. Maybe.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's essentially, freedom to or freedom from.
Right.
And your book kind of made me think about that a little bit, and how we maybe at this point in our history have been thinking more about freedom from than freedom to.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, one or two the reviews that have come back to me from the book so far have been mostly positive, but one or two people saying, well, it's a bit implausible. How are we going to create this kind of democratic sort of small farm freedom? And it's a good question, but it's true, I think, of more or less all progressive visions for the future. How are we going to retain a sense of freedom? How are we going to retain democratic institutions? So I think the more that we can emphasize kind of personal autonomy, creating a personal livelihood, and that being a goal for everyone, not just some subset of the population, the easier it will be. But it's a conversation that we need to be having. And I think some of these things, in some ways, you sort of get the so-called automation discourse that this is all going to be easier because we're going to have machines and low carbon energy that's going to take the hard work out of it. I don't think that's going to happen. But going back to what we were just talking about, I don't think hard work, I don't think a sense of personal autonomy and creating a livelihood is a negative here. I think it's a positive, but we do need to be continuing to put it into that civic tradition and not into a narrow, not into a nationalist position, not into a kind of racial or colonial tradition, that we need to sort of embrace the complexity of the modern world, and the fact that I think I say somewhere in the book that we're all children of a failing modernity. In some sense, it's a huge disadvantage that most of us don't have farm backgrounds or rural roots. But the advantage of it is it means that very few people can say, well, I'm a real local, I'm a real peasant. We have to kind of make this up as of now together. We have to step into a different future, and we have to do that in all the kind of complexity of the existing world.
Small farms divorced from the security of a wider economic safety net or supply chain aren't always associated with resilience in the popular imagination,
right?
Which may picture instead starvation and deprivation. How do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a chapter in the book called Dearth where I talk about that. I mean, I think the reality is that small farm localism is pretty robust and resilient. You have to build it up over time. I mean, obviously, if everyone moved out of London or New York and tried to set themselves up in a farm right now, there probably would be some starvation going around, and all the more reason why we need to be thinking this through now while we still can. But if you look at famines historically, they have tended not to be people with secure access to farmland. People tend to have resilient cropping strategies. To some extent, it goes back to that vision of a more mixed, more sort of permaculture approach where we've got different crops, trees, fruit, veg, different things in our cropping systems, and you can sort of build some resilience and redundancy into the system that way. If you look at most of the big famines that have happened historically, certainly in recent times, they have tended to be people without political entitlement. They have occurred. It's not people who live in the big cities because the powers that be tend to look out for them, and it's not people who are living on farms. It's kind of poor people without a political voice and without access to land who tend to be in the front line of it. So and increasingly, there is urban hunger. People kind of get moved off. Get divested of secure access to farmland. Are in precarious urban situations, and there's a lot of hunger in those situations. So, basically, if we build this up over time, if you build a functioning civic local farm culture with good access to farmland, good access to property rights for the majority of people over time, it's not as problematic as you might think. And as I say, famine history teaches us that it's not the small farmers that suffer. It's the people caught in between, and often it's people who are caught in big global commodity markets. It might be a farmer, small coffee farmer, for example. Global coffee prices tank. They don't have enough money to buy the necessities of life. The last significant famine in England that I mentioned in the book that happened in the 17th century was specialist livestock farmers who were producing for market and got hit by market price. So in many ways, it's the kind of big faceless global market dynamics or big faceless global politics that causes famine, not a kind of small scale farming economy.
I want to know more about how we implement a small farm future. It's such a radical reshuffling of industrial society. And this might be a good opportunity to talk about rethinking land ownership and the idea of property.
Yep. How do we implement it? If I had the answer to that,
you have some answers, I think.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the problems I talk about it. This is what I talk about in part 4 of the book. I think we have got into this kind of modernist mindset that there is this kind of linear progress, whether that is coming from a capitalist perspective that, if everyone, pursues their own self-interest in the market, that will generate benefits for all, or you get a kind of socialist or communist approach that, the immiseration of the working class is going to lead to a revolution that will institute a more fair and just and productive society. And I guess I don't really see any of those linear narratives really being persuasive anymore. We've got kind of widespread systemic failure that we have to reckon with and juggle with. And I kind of, in a way, I suppose you could say even it's a sort of permaculture move in terms of politics in the last part of the book, that the problem is the solution. I mean, I think what we're going to have is in some ways quite chaotic processes of ruralization and large-scale migration, and people are going to have to make things up as they go along. I mean, I mentioned Rebecca Solnit's book, her interesting phrase, "A Paradise Made in Hell," where she talks about in moments of great crisis, people are actually quite good at looking out for each other, coming together, sort of getting food, getting welfare services. Of course, that's easy in a short-term crisis. What I'm talking about here is a long-term crisis. So we have to move beyond, that kind of immediate self-help and looking out for people, and creating longer-term structures. And that's where you mentioned property rights or common rights. I mean, I talk about that a fair bit in the book. I think people can be a little bit naive or about commons or commons-based solutions. And that's where in the book I draw on a kind of longer history of looking at commons. I mean, Elinor Ostrom's work is quite interesting in that respect, in looking at how people create ways of working together and how they sometimes fail, places in which they work or situations in which they work and ones that they don't. And generally, I think, when you look at agricultural history, what you find is, I talk about the elemental commons, where things like water or fire risk, or sometimes ways of managing soil and territory on a large scale, you can't do that as an individual small-scale farmer, so you work with other people. You create a commons around irrigation or fire management, for example. But you tend to work, on your own account or on a household basis in terms of gardening or cropping, because it's easier to sort of manage your work regimen, easier to intensify and sort of manage the day-to-day aspects of farming in that way. So we need creative, and when you look at agricultural history, people have come up with all sorts of incredibly creative mixed systems of public, private and commons organisation. I mean, there's one or two examples I mentioned in the book. That's what we need to be doing. But, the great danger with private property is that it concentrates in too few hands. Basically, it's like the old Mark Twain adage that, buy land, they ain't making it anymore. So we need to find ways of keeping land available and cycling through being available, being widely available for people to be small-scale farmers, to be, backyard gardeners or what have you. And it's not that difficult to come up with economic policy to do that. I mean, I'm not an economist, but, there's all sorts of things we can talk about, land value tax, inheritance tax, there's all sorts of ways we can do that. The real problem is making it stick politically in the here and now, when we have these powerful modernist narratives, whether it's a sort of capitalist corporate sort of model or a socialist model. And I think we need to move beyond that. Hopefully the way we can do that with minimum possible pain through through the sorts of processes we were talking about earlier, where people are beginning to switch into this kind of local civic way of thinking. But regrettably, I think it is going to come through chaos, through various shocks to the existing system. We've seen that in countries like Argentina and Greece with sort of economic meltdown, or with natural disasters, climate disasters. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but hopefully we can kind of pull all these pieces of the jigsaw together and start coming up with local solutions with people working together on them.
You're clear in the book that a small farm future is not utopian per se, at least not any more utopian than the almost mystical faith that we have in an industrialist capitalist economy that grows and expands out into the infinity of space. Talk about utopias of growth and utopias of development.
Okay, so as we were saying earlier, I think our existing economic, the sort of corporate capitalist model is based on growth. That the kind of system dies if you don't get a return on investment. And growth is it's a little bit pathological. When you think about it in terms of biological systems, organisms grow up to a point and then stop growing and lead a kind of mature existence, without growing further. And that's sort of what we need to do. We need to develop. We need our societies to be stimulating opportunities for us to learn, to work with other people, to develop our skills. But we don't need them to grow, or at least not beyond some kind of natural limit. So that, I think, is the challenge that we have. And again, I think it comes back to creating to having a kind of autonomous, self-reliant life as an individual or as a small community, producing the things that we need in order to get by, learning, working with other people, learning to get along with other people, developing our skills and knowledge, but not kind of barreling past, the natural limits and the natural feedback of the system. And that, incidentally, is kind of a key justification, a key need for a kind of smaller, more localized society, because you kind of get feedback. I mean, I'm talking to you through this computer in front of me at the moment, and I have no idea, where the components came from, what sorts of systems of production and commodity chains were part of it. Whereas the house that I'm sitting in, I'm heating it with wood that I planted myself, just outside the window, and I have a really good sense of what's going on with my wood lot, how much wood I can harvest, whether I'm sort of pushing beyond the boundaries of what's sustainable. And so there's that kind of immediate feedback on my farm, on my homestead, or in my local community about what I can do, how much I can grow, and then how much there's kind of pushback from the natural world. You don't get that feedback in a kind of global commodity-based system, and that's part of the problem that we've got in the modern world, and part of why we need to relocalize. So sure, there's endless ways in which my local community can develop, friendships I can have, walks in the woods, things I can learn. That's the sort of thing we need to be working on, and obviously developing my practice as a farmer, not growing the global economy, not growing these sort of huge networks of commodity exchange over which, we have no control as individuals, or even as national governments anymore, and that have all sorts of negative consequences for people, in terms of exploitation of labor, but also on the planet that we call home.
You sent your book off to the press just as the COVID-19 crisis was taking shape.
Right.
What has the pandemic revealed to you? Has it challenged your ideas? Has it validated them?
That's a good question. I think, I'm slightly nervous to say that it's validated my ideas, because, everyone these days is saying, as the pandemic proves, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of has validated them in the sense that, we've got our little local market garden where normally we get sort of one or two customer requests, new customer requests a week, and then all of a sudden with the pandemic, a mix of things was going on, but it meant that the supermarket shelves were empty, particularly of fresh fruit and veg. And all of a sudden, from like one or two customer requests a week, we had about 200. We brought a bit more land into cultivation and tried as best we could to grow food for vulnerable people in our community. But obviously there was a limit to what we could do. But there is that there aren't very many people producing fruit and veg locally because the market doesn't really encourage it as it presently is, and that's what we need to work on. Now, of course, the supermarkets would say that it was a temporary hiccup in supply. Things got figured out, the shelves refilled. Nevertheless, I think there was a shot across the bows in many ways of all sorts of much more challenging, longer-term interruptions we're going to get to global supply chains in the future. And also, of course, the pandemic itself, part of the problem with it is it's spread like wildfire around the world because we are such a, we're so mobile, and same with animal diseases, really. We've got, small local abattoirs have closed down. We've got all these big super abattoirs that make it hard for small scale farmers with just a few livestock to continue doing things the way they did. And no doubt the biosecurity in these, high tech modern abattoirs and the whole modern food system is very good, but it only takes a small shock to it where it propagates throughout the system. So I think, again, there's a case for building in more resilience, more redundancies, more firewalls, more local control of supply to prevent this sort of thing from happening. And, in a sense, the lockdown is a kind of bad consequence of a global system going wrong. What we need to do is kind of take the lessons from that and create more of a kind of local interaction and a local civic order that doesn't have that negative side that we've just seen so tragically with the pandemic.
World leaders are now talking about transforming and rethinking the global economy in the face of the pandemic, and they're acknowledging many of the interlocking crises you outline in the book. Are we finally grappling with reality? I mean, when I think about your small farm future, I sort of imagine it as a plan that's behind a pane of glass that, says break in case of emergency. Are we at that point now? Or do you see us sort of pulling ourselves back from the precipice?
To be honest, I think we're still in the lower foothills. World leaders are taking some of these issues seriously, but climate change, that's a big one that people are now talking about more seriously. But again, I think the model tends to be a high-tech centralized one. Here in the UK, it's about building more nuclear power stations, building offshore wind farms, and we can debate the rights and wrongs of that. Low carbon energy is better than high carbon energy, but there isn't really coming from the political centre. There isn't really a kind of language of greater local resilience or relocalization. I think there are some moves afoot. That there is a sort of conversation about land reform beginning to happen in the UK, more in some of the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales more than in England. There are people beginning to think about farming in some different ways, less sort of productivist commodity farming that's subsidized financially from the centre, more farming that's looking at providing what people call public goods, or more nature-friendly farming. So there are things afoot, but I'm not really seeing it coming from world leadership. Obviously we've got the new administration coming in the US, which at least is one that kind of believes that climate change is actually happening. We've got sort of stuff happening in China in terms of more carbon-friendly policies, but I think I don't really see it coming from the top. I see it coming from bottom up local activism in the context of the shocks that are beginning to propagate through the existing system.
Yeah, there's such a contrast with what you outline in your book and what sort of global world leaders are looking to do, which is really, in my view, to centralize power more and more. How do you reconcile those two things? Or I guess you don't, but is that the trend you're seeing, as well as just a focus on more and more authoritarian sort of measures to address global crises?
Yeah, I talk in the book about what I call the supersedure state. To be honest, I think centralized states, that is the instinct of our whole global political system that has emerged over a long period of time, is a very kind of centralized, ramifying network, and it's based on cheap and abundant energy. I see that changing, and I see centralized political power having to juggle with more and more problems. And essentially, I think, there's different ways it can pan out. And, I'd rather not be writing about the future at all, because I'm almost certainly going to be wrong. But I think that's kind of the reality that we have to face nowadays is, we need to be thinking about system change, because it surely is going to change. So the supersedure state I talk about in the book is essentially where centralized government, it's got too much on its plate. It's trying to take too much from people, not giving enough back to people. And I think it will start to kind of retreat into its core areas, and that is going to be an extremely challenging time, and I don't know how it will pan out. But one way in which it might pan out, which is what we were talking about earlier, is the need for people to create civic institutions locally to figure out, how are we going to produce our energy, how are we going to produce our food, how are we going to produce peace and kind of a civic order locally. We're going to have to get along with each other and produce things for ourselves in ways that we can no longer just expect to go down to the supermarket and that the government will have its finger on the pulse of some sort of global supply network that's just going to we can just fill our trolleys and fill our carts and go home. So it's going to be tough, challenging times, but that's kind of how I see the most positive possible scenarios playing out. And it is happening. The small town Frome where I live here, we've got an independent local council that is trying to sort of create better conversations between people locally, more autonomy, get away from this kind of centre to locality model, the Democrats or Republicans, get away from that kind of politics and get more into a kind of local people having conversations about what they need and how they can get along. So I do see some positive moves there and potential, but there's a lot of ways in which that can go wrong and a lot of difficulties that we're going to need to step up to.
Well, Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
There you have it. Go buy Chris's book at acresusa.com. We have a bookstore there that has hundreds of titles on regenerative and sustainable and organic farming. Use the coupon code JANPOD, that's JANPOD, for 10% off on all titles. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tractor Time, brought to you by Acres USA and Barn to Door. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, iTunes, or anywhere podcasts are available. Also find us on acresusa.com, ecofarmingdaily.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our monthly magazine. Thanks again for listening and have a great week.